Good day, everyone. My name is Jessica Porras, and I am the Senior Manager for Education and Outreach at CAQH CORE. It's my pleasure to welcome you today to our Phase IV CAQH CORE Connectivity Webinar Encore presentation. Before we begin, I'd like to mention some logistical items. You can download a copy of today's presentation from the caqh.org website. To do so, navigate to the CORE pull-down menu at the top of the caqh.org welcome screen and select the CORE Education Events page. A link to the PDF version of the presentation can be found under the listing for today's webinar. One new feature is that we will also be sending you the slides and the registration when it's available. So if you don't have access to the slides, sit tight. You'll get that in about a day. Now on this slide, you can see a screenshot of the SMD GoToWebinar dashboard. You should see something that looks similar to this on the right side of your computer desktop. When joining today's session, it's possible you may have joined the audio portion of the webinar using your company's speakers by default. If possible, we would prefer you to join the webinar audio by telephone. To do this, please select the telephone audio button in the audio panel of your dashboard, and the dial-in information will be displayed. Make sure you enter your audio PIN, which is found under your dial-in information. We will save time at the end of today's program dedicated to responding to your questions. We encourage you to submit your questions at any time during this webinar by typing them into the questions panel of your dashboard. We do ask that when you submit your questions, you identify the type of organization you're with so we can better respond to your question. So today we have a lot of information to share with you. We'll start off with background and some drill down on the safe harbor principle. Then we'll spend some time on connectivity requirement applicability. And after that, we'll delve right into the technical requirements, and we'll focus on some of the areas that we know you've been clamoring for, such as SOAP+WSDL and digital certificates, which are the topics that you requested a little bit more information on during the last connectivity webinar. And we'll make sure to also leave plenty of time for your questions. And remember that you can ask your questions at any time. So let's get started with our first polling question, Drew.
Great. Thank you very much, Jessica. So our first question of the day, and this will help kind of set the table a little bit for what we're a little bit of what we're going to talk about, and this deals with the core safe harbor principle. It's something we've asked everyone about, and it's information we've provided a few times, but we wanted to start today's presentation with a question on the core safe harbor principle. So I will read the question and I will launch the poll for everyone to answer right on their computer. So first question is, please rate your understanding of the core safe harbor principle on a scale of 1 to 5. And you can see the scale here. So I will launch the poll right now, and we will pause for about 20 seconds or so for everyone to respond, in which we will share the results. Take about 10 more seconds. Again, just answer right on your computer screen. All right, I'll close the poll and I will share the results. Well, as you can see, the biggest percentage, 28%, said very weak, and then about 23 and 22% in between there, somewhat strong, neither strong nor weak, or somewhat weak, and only 6%, the minority here, said very strong, and 80% of the audience voted in this poll. So I think that's good to see, in that we have information here that hopefully will help those who answered with the core safe harbor principle.
Yeah, and one other thing is maybe this should also determine, focusing on this topic a little more on future webinars. So this is very helpful information.
Exactly. And Bob, that brings us to your section, so take it away when you're ready.
Great. Thanks, Drew. Thanks, Jessica. And just as Drew and Jessica set the table for us, set the agenda, we want to go ahead and make sure we provide that background and also some of the key requirements on our safe harbor principle. So the next slide, you'll see that the Phase 4 rule set is really a natural evolution of the work that we've been doing over the past several years in developing operating rules for the other transactions. The previous ones included eligibility and claim status for Phase 1 and 2, and also the EFT and the ERA transaction for Phase 3. So now here in Phase 4, we've developed a rule set to encompass requirements specific for the healthcare claim, or the 837, the referral, certification, or authorization, commonly referred to as the 278, also the enrollment and disenrollment transaction, the 834, and lastly, the 820, the healthcare premium payment transaction. So we've focused our effort on those 4 transactions. We have not addressed healthcare claims attachments just yet. That will be something we'll be tackling as well. So we have set up to ensure that the operating rules encompass this last set of transactions that are all required under the ACA mandate for operating rules. So you can see we've done this over the last few years, and we're making sure that we keep the methodology in place of developing very specific requirements around infrastructure and, where needed, also around data content. For Phase 4, you'll see that we have only developed requirements around infrastructure. So on the next slide, you'll see that there are specific requirements only related to infrastructure. And it's for each of the 4 transactions, and many of them are quite familiar if you're familiar with Phase 1, 2, or 3. We have very specific requirements around processing mode for batch or real-time. Again, some of the transactions do require batch, like claims, enrollment, premium payment. Those you must support batch requirements. We also have requirements around the safe harbor connectivity, which we'll talk about in just a moment. Also around system availability and companion guide template. Because these transactions in this final rule set, or this Phase 4 rule set, are so diverse, from prior authorization to claims to premium payment, there are specific requirements that are related to those specific types of transactions. So there's a requirement there for claims that if you have a specific guidance for COB, that type of information must be included in your companion guide. So just as an example, that the requirements are specific to infrastructure and the conduct of the transaction. And as I mentioned before, on the next slide, on slide 8, the rules do build upon each other. All going back to Phase 1, where we had a simple requirement for the use of public internet and HTTPS, to Phase 2, we defined very specific message metadata, envelope standards, authentication standards, transport security standards, and even message interactions. We've expanded that into Phase 4 as well, diverging onto a single message envelope standard for both real-time and batch, and a single submitter authentication standard. So this has been a phased approach, a progression, seeing what works in the industry, what really are the technical requirements that the industry is moving towards, and to ensure that we're meeting all the needs of the industry stakeholders. And so the stakeholders have come together under CORE and developed this phased approach, and you'll see that evolution in the connectivity rules as well. On the next slide, delving into the safe harbor principle, the Phase 4, just like in the previous phases, does have and require support of a safe harbor. So what is the Phase 4 safe harbor? Basically, Phase 4 safe harbor is the Phase 4 connectivity rule requirements for a compliant interface to allow the transactions to be conducted in a way that all trading partners can conduct the transactions in. And those specific requirements you'll find detailed in the rules, but there's no requirement to use the core compliant method if trading partners agree to use a different requirement. So the requirement is you must support this at a minimum, but if you already have connections established between a large hospital system and you as a health plan, and it's a VPN, it's a system that you've had in place for several years now, there's no need to disconnect or dismantle that and move and migrate everything over to the safe harbor connectivity requirements, because the safe harbor allows you to maintain that connection you already have in place. Again, the safe harbor is to allow really flexibility within the industry. And more details on the safe harbor are found on the next slide, where we go into a little more detail, again, where entities must implement the minimum requirements for the connectivity requirements for Phase 4 to conduct these 4 transactions. And you must support those if a trading partner requests to conduct the transaction in that way. So ABC Clearinghouse wishes to connect with you as a payer, for example, and they wish to connect and conduct the claims transaction using the core connectivity. You're required to support that minimum requirement to allow that clearinghouse to connect with you using that core connectivity safe harbor. But it does not, again, require you to dismantle things that you already have in place, connections that you have with your existing trading partners. It doesn't mean that you can't slowly transition them over if they wish, and you come together as a joint agreement and do that. But it does not require you to disconnect anything that you already have existing in place. You can continue to offer those existing communications and security methods as well. So you can sign on new trading partners using your same old connectivity that you're used to using and supporting. But again, at a minimum requirement, you must support the Phase 4 connectivity requirement. So hopefully that clears up some of the confusion around what the safe harbor is. And we'll hear some more details around the connectivity requirements throughout the rest of the presentation. So Drew, I'll hand the call back over to you for our second polling question.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Bob. And so this brings us to our second polling question of the webinar. And like the first one, I'll read the question, and then I will launch the poll for everyone to directly answer into on their computer screens. So this question asks, which of the following would you consider to be the biggest challenge to your organization's implementation of the Phase 4 CAQH CORE 470 connectivity rule version 4.0.0? And so I will launch that poll right now. And we will pause for just a few moments for everyone to respond. And this is select all that apply, I believe. Nope, this is just a choose one. It'll take about 5 more seconds. And Bob, I might ask you to maybe comment on the results when I display those here. All right, I will close the poll and share the results. And it looks like the largest percentage, 40%, indicates having enough time and staff for implementation, followed by 29% saying fully understanding the requirements. Then 11% shared by both decision makers have not given the go-ahead, as well as no major challenges, so very good for that 11%, and then 9% indicating not applicable. So Bob, do you have any thoughts on what you see here?
Yeah, definitely. I think that with the rules not being mandated as of yet, there's still really a voluntary category of operating rules. So you do have time to make sure that you can fully understand the requirements, and hopefully through education sessions like this, many of the tools that we're developing for the Phase 4 rule set, an extensive list of FAQs, different tools that are being made available like our test suite and our analysis and planning guide, they're all on our website and ready for consumption. So they're already there, they're all free and available. So some of that hopefully will help mitigate that education gap and understanding of the rule requirements. We also have our a great tool that folks have used quite extensively, and that is our request process. If you have something that you need better understanding of, send in a request, and we'll have one of our consultant experts review that and get a great response out to you, hopefully clearing up any confusion. So along with the fact that we don't yet have a due date, that might help. You can spend some time and resources, again, accessing all of our free resources that we have available. So more to come on some of those questions, hopefully towards the end of the session to help address some of your education needs. But with that, I think we can probably move on to Raja.
Yeah, and so then we will now move on with Raja Kailar. He's the CEO of Binatal, and he will take us through the Phase 4 CAQH CORE connectivity requirement applicability. Raja, go ahead.
Thanks, Drew. Can you hear me okay?
Yep, loud and clear.
Okay, great. So in this section, good afternoon, everyone. And in this section, what we are going to look at, first of all, is the applicability and some of the background information on the Phase IV connectivity rule before we get into the more detailed technical requirements drill down in the next section, which is going to be covered by my colleague Kevin Castello. So first of all, within this Phase IV rule, the main problem that was addressed was the fact that these 4 transactions that Bob touched upon in the previous section, claims, prior authorization, benefit enrollment, premium payment transactions. The exchange of these transactions, there are a variety of ways being used in the industry, and this variation drives up transaction costs and increases complexity. The industry realized this and got together and came up with a uniform approach of exchanging these transactions, and that's in the form of the Phase IV connectivity operating rule. And this is intended to promote better interoperability, simpler connectivity, better security, and in the end, save time and money for the industry. Next slide, please. So as Bob mentioned, the Phase IV connectivity rule is a safe harbor. It's built on the foundation set by the previous phases, which means it continues to use the internet as the underlying transport medium, using the HTTPS as the underlying transport protocol. And this new Phase IV safe harbor applies to the 4 transactions listed in the box in the middle. And the rule is applicable to both real-time and batch transactions. And since it's a safe harbor, it doesn't require any of the trading partners to discontinue using the connectivity approaches that they already use, as long as they offer out this approach as a common approach for those trading partners that do request the use of this connectivity approach. Next slide, please. So the technical scope of the connectivity rule, we've used the OSI model to define the technical scope. The model has 7 layers. It's shown on the far right of this diagram. The topmost layer being the application layer, and the message encapsulation layer is the other layers 6 and 5, the presentation layer and the session layer. And the transport and network layer are layers 4 and 3. The transport and network layer have been standardized by the core Phase I operating rules in terms of using the public internet and the HTTPS layer. So really our focus in Phase IV is layers 5 and 6 of the OSI model, which together form the message encapsulation layer. Next slide, please. So this is another view of the same type of information. What you see in blue in the diagram, which we fondly call the onion diagram, on the left, the blue layer is the message envelope or message metadata layer, and that's the layer outside the message payload, which is the HIPAA administrative transaction payload. And it is also the layer inside of the communication transport protocol layer, which is formulated by the HTTP over SSL or TLS. And the final layer on the outside is the the network layer, which is provided by the public internet. That's the TCP/IP layer. Next slide, please. The connectivity rule can be applied independent of the underlying communication architecture and model. 2 models are shown in this diagram. The model on the left is one where a client interacts directly with a server. This is a B2B or business-to-business interaction. And the second model that you see in the middle is one where a client, or the submitter in this case, is interacting with a server through an intermediary such as a clearinghouse. So both these models are places where the connectivity rule can be applied. Where the connectivity rule doesn't apply is that third model that you see on the right, where you have a consumer interacting directly with a business, such as in the case of direct data entry through a web portal. So that's a situation, that's a scenario where the connectivity rule doesn't apply. Next slide, please. The connectivity rule, the Phase IV connectivity rule, has technical requirements such as the message envelope and authentication requirements, which Kevin will cover in more detail. But what there is a conformance requirement. These conformance requirements are defined in the infrastructure rules, the Phase IV infrastructure rules, which essentially specify what a healthcare a stakeholder is required to do in terms of a minimum technical role. For instance, a healthcare provider, the minimum technical role is that of a client. A health plan, a minimum technical role is that of a server, and a clearinghouse or a switch plays the role of both client and server. Again, this is a minimum technical role. Entities can and do go beyond this minimum technical role, and there may be other entities such as a health plan sponsor that may also play a role as part of some of these transactions. Next slide, please. So there's two primary modes of message interactions in the Phase IV connectivity rule. The synchronous mode is used for the real-time interaction, where a client submits a request and waits on that session for a reply from the server. The diagram at the bottom of this slide shows an interaction where you have a real-time request and a response coming back on the same connection. And the one below that shows a batch interaction in asynchronous mode, where a client submits a batch in session 1, and it may pick up its results on session 2, which is an asynchronous mode of communication. So that's typically the interaction used for a batch mode processing. Next slide, please. So a key concept in Phase IV, and this has been applied as well as in Phase II as well, is that of a message envelope outside of the payload. And in terms of a real-world example, the US mail uses an envelope, and this is useful to provide the address of the sender and receiver, and it helps with the uniform and efficient processing of the contents of the envelope. Similarly, in the EDI world, the use of a normative message envelope, normative meaning a definitive message envelope, helps with the efficient routing of the payload. In this case, the payload is the X12 transaction, and it also helps protect the security and the integrity of the payload. And it describes what's in the payload and how that payload needs to be processed. Next slide, please. So this visual shows how the core, the various phases of core connectivity rules have facilitated administrative simplification by enabling interoperability and security. The visual on the far left shows the situation where there were no operating rules, and there was a variety of approaches for sending and receiving these transactions. The next block shows the application of Phase I connectivity rule, which essentially standardized on the use of the internet and the HTTPS protocol as a safe harbor approach for exchanging certain transactions. Phase II built on that foundation and provided a prescriptive message envelope and authentication standards. Phase IV further refines the requirements in Phase II and provides a new safe harbor for this new set of transactions by converging on a single envelope and single authentication standard. And by doing so, it's facilitating better interoperability and simpler connectivity and easier operation and more robust operation and more secure operation. And with that, I'm going to pass it on to Kevin Castello for a drill down of the connectivity requirements. Thank you. Kevin?
Great. Okay. Thank you very much, Raja. Again, my name is Kevin Castello. I'm a senior consultant with Vinatal. And we can move on or just go ahead and get into the topics here on the next slide. Now the technical improvements that we've got described on the left, these are for, again, the topic is the Phase IV Core Connectivity version 4.0. And the implementer feedback that we took in, it came from FAQs and questions received by core participants and implementers. The transport security was improved by adding support for newer versions of TLS. The payload and processing modes, which are now included in a separate document. And the simplification for implementers occurred. This is as part of the Phase IV connectivity, as it converged on the use of SOAP envelopes and authentication with the use of the X509 digital certificates. Over on the right, referring to or mentioning here the transactional support that was enhanced in Core Connectivity Phase 4. We've got additional transaction support was added for claims, the premium payments, the benefit enrollments, and prior authorizations. While the Phase 4 is also continued, as Bob mentioned, the Phase 4 continues support for a core safe harbor provision, which allows implementers to implement the Phase 2 and or the Phase 4 connectivity for all transactions. The next slide. Now, Phase 4 only supports one enveloping method, and that enveloping method is what we refer to as a SOAP+WSDL. Now, SOAP itself is a protocol that's used to structure information using XML. And XML is itself another standard that is a meta language that allows users or developers to define their own customized way of describing data. The XSD component of all this, the XSD is the schema. This defines the elements using, all contained within an XML document. While the WSDL, this file depends on the XSD for its definitions. And as we kind of walk into, what is the WSDL? The WSDL is the Web Services Description Language. This is an XML document, just like the previous two, describes the message interactions so that an automated development tool or design tool, or typically developers are maybe the only ones that really look at and open up these types of files. They can use it to describe and develop the interactions that are necessary to support Core Connectivity Phase 4. So next slide. All right, now the Core Connectivity Envelope Standard, as I mentioned, it's a SOAP+WSDL, and then there's an XSD component. What we're looking at here is a snippet of the XSD. It's shown with two custom elements defined, and we can see the custom elements. They are also in yellow, which relate to the real-time request and response. If we move on, I want to go just to the next slide. Okay, I'm sorry, back up. I thought we had one where we had an enhanced view of this where we could see the text just a little bit clearer, but I guess, so we'll just stay here. The green there is the metadata defined for the request and the response definitions. Within the green sections, you've got the elements. They have the value type is to the right, which is, in this case, it may be difficult to see it, but you've got most of them are string value types, or there is a base 64 binary option there for the payload type. And then as you move to the right, you've got your first attribute, or one of the attributes then of this element, which defines how many times this element would occur. You see that with the min occurs. Min occurs equal to 1 means that it is a mandatory element. And then the max occurs equal to 1 means that it can't repeat. So if that max occurs was higher, then you can have repetition of that particular element within the message. But in this case, and in this snippet, what we're seeing is just just elements that are required to appear only one time. So you want to move on to the next slide. All right. Now the WSDL, it does have common components, and that's what we're kind of showing here. Again, I want to just remind you that the WSDL itself is a file that's really meant to be used by development tools to help it build interfaces with the expected messages and interactions. It does that with these components as they're defined there on the left, and that's what's contained in this file. Core does, CAQH Core does provide the XSD and the WSDL as part of the core connectivity rule, and it is available on the website. Since I mentioned that you use automated tools or development tools, CORE strongly recommends that you don't point any of your environments really to read that file directly from the website. Always, the recommendation is go ahead and grab it or download it locally to your network, and then work with the file from a local location where your tools can always be assured of accessing it, because the CAQH CORE website is subject to change, and those locations may get modified. That's when, if you're just pointing to them in a dynamic fashion, you can run into some problems and some broken links there. So you want to move on to the next slide. Okay, now all right. Now the box on the right, this is the machine version of a real-time request being submitted by the 278 prior authorization. It's a 278 prior authorization request is our example. And this, what you're looking at, is this is exactly what the server would see as it receives the message. And now here I got, if we want to move to the next slide, this is where I got crossed up a little bit. Thought we had this on the previous one too. So this is the same example, just so that we can try and see and take a look at what's actually written there within each section. So the top section, this is the HTTP headers. These are the part of the HTTP standard, and they help describe the overall message. Now the middle section, this is the important section for today's presentation. This is showing the SOAP envelope in gray, which contains the core metadata using XML. And the elements are highlighted in yellow are the core metadata. We've got items like payload processing type, payload ID, a timestamp. These are all found in this section. And even the attachment itself, the attachment to the payload here is mapped from the payload section, which contains a pointer to the bottom section. And this approach is what's referred to as the MTOM attachment to the message. You may recognize, if you're familiar with the previous versions, that the previous connectivity phases utilize an inline payload for the real-time messaging. But now here in Core Connectivity Phase 4, real-time and batch processes now are both aligned to use an MTOM attachment. So that's where we have some commonality now between both the real-time and batch that we didn't have in previous phases of connectivity. So we'll move on to the next slide. Now this is just a quick slide showing the document organization. The external documents to the Phase 4 connectivity rule are shown on the right. We've reviewed the XML and the WSDL, and then I'm just going to refer to the processing modes and external payloads are also now part of an external document. So we can move on to the next one. Now this slide, we're looking at the basics of the security required to send a core connectivity message. The transport security within the core connectivity protects the message in terms of confidentiality and integrity, while the submitter authentication provides the identity information between the two known trading partners. Core connectivity, as you may already realize, it's server-to-server connectivity. It's always using established and known trading partners for those connections. And as the note at the very bottom there, just kind of as a reminder, the core connectivity rules they're establishing a floor and not a ceiling as far as being able to add security measures to your connections. All right, so next slide. Staying on the topic of security improvements from Phase 2 to Phase 4, first we've got the submitter authentication, which has been strengthened by converging on the X509 digital certificate authentication and by removing support for username passwords, which were considered a weaker form of authentication. The transport security has been enhanced with the optional use of TLS version 1.1 or higher, in addition to using SSL v3 or in lieu of SSL v3, especially if your organization needs to be FIPS 142 compliant, or even in the case where your organization needs to support a stronger level of security or has policies that require to use a stronger transport level security. Yes, as an example, here at the bottom, these different types of connections. There's a client connecting to a federal health plan with a FIPS compliant connection, and then for a commercial health plan with the use of SSL v3 or TLS v1.1 or higher, whichever is permitted by that commercial health plan in this example. So that's where a client may be making different types of connections depending on who the server is. Right, so next slide. Now on the left here, this is a picture of a digital certificate and the information that's stored on a digital certificate. You can generally find this within a browser. If you go to an SSL website, you may see a padlock. You can double-click that padlock and start to view certificate information being provided. And the certificate is similar to a driver's license. You can think of it, it's issued by a third party, which is your Department of Motor Vehicles. It includes information about a specific subject. In this case, since we're talking about computers, it's servers or systems that are being identified. And not only is the subject information provided, but you've also got encryption information, like the size of the keys and the key algorithms that were utilized to generate that public key. All of that information is stored there in that certificate. In the diagram on the right, this is where we're showing the certificate authority. It's, again, the certificate authority, you can think of it as your DMV. It's similar, where it issues the certificates. The client and the server, they're both going to need to rely on the information that's been proofed by that certificate authority. In order for that system, the entire system and that ecosystem where this certificate authority and the client and the server interact, this is where you get you establish your level of trust within that environment. And just like you have multiple DMVs, one for each state, you can definitely have multiple certificate authorities, and it doesn't have to be the same one for both the client and the server. So next slide. As you're implementing or working through the requirements for core connectivity phase 4, there's some common project considerations that we went ahead and just listed out. These are not rule requirements, but instead what we're showing here are examples and areas that can be used to help your organization. There in that first section, a listing of where to find good examples of security policies online. If your organization doesn't happen to have a security policy at this point, or even just want to review your security policy to make sure it's got the right type of content in it, these are great areas, great sources to find it. Within the design phase, you've got decisions including whether or not to select an in-house solution or outsourcing, you should also think about documenting your organizational certificate practices. This is where you would use a certificate practice statement. And once again, there are examples available from the IETF and NIST in developing those types of documentation around your security and how you're using, the digital certificates within your organization. And as you're deploying digital certificates, considerations like, capabilities like revoking certificates, renewing certificates, and then the ability to just keep up with as new algorithms come out or new versions of TLS are emerging, just being able to keep up with that information and to be able to incorporate it back into the total life cycle of the certificates in that environment with your organization are all things to consider. So next slide. This is a kind of a high-level description of how SSL TLS connections are actually established. The diagram at the top, this is going to show, we're describing where the pieces are that are needed to establish SSL and TLS connections. And there on the left, we've got a provider as a client and a health plan as the server. And then we can review those steps 1 through 6. We've got a provider initiates a connection to the health plan. The health plan server sends back its digital certificate information to the provider. This is where step 3 now the provider is going to say, well, did the URL that I requested, did I actually go to the right location? And that's where it verifies that by taking a look at the certificate information. Step 4, this is where you end up with the mutual authentication. This is where the two-way authentication is occurring, where the provider now sends back a client certificate to the health plan server. and now the health plan server verifies the provider as a known trading partner. So at step 6, this is now that all the information has been exchanged and it's all been verified, that the secure connection is established, and from this point forward, now you have a secure transport layer where everything will be encrypted that travels across that wire within that session. All right, so next slide. Now here we just want to, there are considerations again around the use of SSL v3 and the TLS 1.1 or higher. These, just like on the previous slide, these are great areas. We've got some links here from that are online where you can look for information as you're going through your analysis and planning, and how to develop a policy statement for the use of SSL and TLS 1.1 or higher, just where it needs to be utilized or where it would be required within your organization. It's kind of documenting or making actual policy statements within your organization to ensure that those connections are always set up correctly. Then the design and implementation considerations, and this is where I've touched on, there are different sets of algorithms where they can be used. Keep in mind, each version of TLS may change or now support newer versions of algorithms. Utilize the NIST 852 documentation for information around which algorithms are the best ones or ones to support. Also decide if you're SSL and TLS. Again, you've got the choice of having it in-house or something that's outsourced. And as you're managing a deployment and your maintenance considerations, always make sure that you're considering what your trading partners are able to support as well. All right, so we'll move on to the next slide. Now the transactions in Phase 4 are shown in detail. We've got on this slide. If we start with the 8x12, 837 for healthcare claims, these are supported using batch mode as a requirement, where the real-time mode is optional. The 278 prior auth is supported in either real-time or batch mode, but it does not require, there's no requirement there for a server to implement both of those options. For the 820 premium payment, batch mode is required, but real-time is optional. And the last transaction listed here is the 834 benefit enrollment, which batch mode is required, but real-time mode is optional. And any of this information, you're going to find this. This is the type of information you would find in that external document, the core required processing mode and payload type tables version 4.0 document. That was the third external component that's part of the core connectivity Phase 4 or version 4.0. So next slide. All right, now we're getting into, this is an example of batch processing. I'm going to just jump right into it. And here on the, pay attention, one of the important pieces is you got a healthcare provider on the left and a health plan on the right. Those are your two actors. And between step 1 and 2, this is the batch submission traveling to the health plan. With step 3 and 4, this is the batch acknowledgement retrieval request. With step 4 is the acknowledgement coming back, which is the 999 acknowledgement or TA1 error. Step 5 and 6 is the batch results retrieval request, where step 6 is the results being sent back. And then step 7 and 8 is the batch results acknowledgement, which is acknowledged either with the 999 acknowledgement or the TA1 error by the healthcare provider that was in step 7. So we can move on to the next slide. Now we get into, this is the real-time interaction with a single X12 transaction. Now obviously real-time, you can tell just by looking at it real quick, it's got less steps than the previously described, what we were looking at on the previous slide for batch interaction. There are 2 steps for real-time, which consist of a submission, and then you have your response that comes back. The submission here is a prior authorization request, and the health plan response is provided within that same session, and it uses the same connection back to the provider on the left. So that's, that's the important, attributes or differences there with real-time, is that you're utilizing the same connection. We can move on to the next slide. Now the push and pull interactions that we're showing here, we do have detailed descriptions or detailed diagrams, just similar to the batch and the real-time. You can find those in the core connectivity rules for both of these interactions. These two interactions support the 820 and 834 transactions. And with the generic push, if we're looking at that first gray box, this is a client submitting a batch payload to a server and then retrieving the associated acknowledgement or error. And the health plan sponsor is now, it's behaving as a client and is pushing a batch to a health plan server. Now the generic pull, this is a client retrieving a batch payload from a server, then submitting the associated acknowledgement or error. And the health plan here, this is the health plan as the client, is pulling a batch from a health plan sponsor as the server. The push and pull models both have some additional flexibility that can be used as building blocks. It's just another piece that was kind of developed now within the core connectivity phase 4, and we can move on to the next slide. All right, so now the diagram on the top right, this is showing the various layers that support the core connectivity. Again, Raja touched on these with the OSI model. We've got the error handling could occur at any of these layers. And so we've got the rule provides normative error codes. However, where there's standards like HTTP and they already have error codes, that's where the rule is just going to rely upon the existing HTTP error codes for any errors that happen at that layer. You've got SOAP and you've got payload processing errors. The payload processing errors are not defined by core connectivity. Those would fall into your own business logic and what you want to be able to return back, depending on where it fails within your own processing. Now, the core error codes were improved with the implementer feedback. This is one of the areas where we got a decent number of questions and calls around these. The new error codes that are added and described, they're in the first 2 rows, and then the error codes that were removed, they're located in the bottom 2 rows of the table. The error codes that were removed, we're able to do that because once we converged on the single envelope, and there was no more use of the MIME multi-part. These error codes that were removed were really existed only to support the MIME implementation, and they became obsolete once that enveloping method was removed from the connectivity rule. And you're able to get similar errors just through the use of SOAP faults that are already built in and part of the implementation, as long as you're using the SOAP, what we call the SOAP+WSDL envelope. So I think we can move on to the next slide, and that may be a survey question, I think. So great. Drew, I'll pass it back to you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. That's a lot of information, and really appreciate it. And this brings us to our third and final polling question of the webinar. And just like the last few times, I'll read the question and launch the poll. And this one asks, what CAQH Core connectivity topics would you like to learn more about in future CAQH Core educational webinars? And this question is to help Jessica and I. So I will launch this poll, and we'll pause for about 20 seconds for everyone to respond. And while you're responding, I'll say we give only 3 options here, but if you have other ideas on this or other topics you would like to hear more of, please give us please contact us and let us know. We're always happy to hear. And this one is a check all that apply. Take about 5 more seconds. Jessica, I might have you comment. All right, I will close the poll and share the results. And got an even score here, 61% implementer case studies, as well as batch and real-time interaction models, and then followed by safe harbor principle. I know we talked a little bit about that today, but it seems like we can't talk too much about the core safe harbor principle. What do you think, Jessica?
Well, this is really helpful information, and we are already planning some future programming where we want to include implementers, because I know it's easier to learn and to glean best practices and challenges when you hear from your colleagues. So it's good to hear it resonate with this polling information, and also for sure we kind of know what our next connectivity webinar is going to focus on, right? Batch in real time with a little safe harbor sprinkled. on top. So this feedback is extremely valuable. Thank you.
Yeah.
So looks like we have some time for Q&A. As you know, please submit your questions by typing them into the questions panel on your dashboard. And so let's get started. The first question is for Bob, and the question is, what is the HHS timeline to mandate Phase IV CORE rules?
Hey, Jessica, thank you. HHS has not yet mandated the Phase IV CORE rule set at this time. They have the rule set, CAQH CORE, we have met with NCBHS at their recent hearing and presented the CORE rules to them. They are well aware that they are complete. They have many supporting materials to help implementers implement the rules, but they have not yet issued any letter to HHS, nor has HHS issued any sort of regulation or policy for their adoption. So we're still awaiting for that decision process to take place. And it's kind of, we wait for them to make that decision. So we don't have a time frame for the Phase IV rule set at this time. But they are complete. They are available for free on our website, and all of the supporting materials are being developed or already developed and available on the website for implementers to go ahead and begin their gap analysis process, talking with their leadership to secure funding for the projects or sponsorship for the projects. So all of that can now take place. We just do not have those specific dates yet.
Thank you, Bob. I've got another question, and I think this one's for Raja. And the question is, do the Phase IV rules mandate all covered entities implement real-time transaction technology, or do the standards for real-time only apply if the covered entity makes the decision to support real-time transactions?
The short answer is no, they don't mandate that all covered entities implement real-time transaction technology. The real-time requirements apply to entities that choose to implement the real-time processing mode. The processing mode requirements for the Phase IV transactions are specified in the payload type tables, payload type and processing mode document that Kevin mentioned in his presentation. And within that document, for each of these transactions, the required processing mode is specified. For instance, for claims, premium payments, and benefit enrollments, batch processing mode is required, and real-time processing mode is optional. And for prior authorization, entities can choose one of the two processing modes, but entities are required to implement at least one of the two modes, although both of the modes are not required. Jessica?
Thank you, Raja. Thank you. The next question is another one for Bob. And someone's interested in hearing an update on what's going on with the certification of compliance rules, since we're now at April and HHS has not issued a regulation. Do you want to comment on that?
That's a great question. This was mentioned, I think, on slide 6. I didn't cover it because the nature of our talk today was technical, but this is a great question that HHS has yet to issue a final rule on health plan certification. That is related to a requirement within the ACA that does require HHS to issue a regulation requiring health plans to certify that their systems are both in compliance with the transactions as well as the applicable operating rules. There was an initial regulation published, however, it has not been finalized. Many members of the industry have commented on that. There was some tie to health plan ID. So there's been some pause in HHS regulation related to the health plan requirements for certification. So more to come. We will probably hear something related to this later this year, perhaps even as early as the summer. Again, the timelines are open to HHS. They're going through their process and through their cycle to ensure that a final rule is published.
Thank you so much. I'm not sure whether this is a question for Raja or Bob, so let me just read it and you guys can pick who wants to answer. The question is, can we have the trading partners that submit through Connectivity Rule 270 change over to the 470 Connectivity Rule, or do we need to keep both rules available for the trading partner?
Bob, do you want me to take a shot at it? Or
Sure, Rajan, I can help.
Okay. The Phase 4 connectivity rule is currently available for voluntary adoption, but the Phase 2 connectivity rule, as well as the entire rule set for Phase 2, is currently still mandated for eligibility, claim status, and ERA transactions by the ACA. So from that standpoint, if you voluntarily adopt the Phase 4 rule, you would still need to maintain the Phase 2 connectivity and offer that out for that set of transactions. Bob, I don't know if you would like to add to that.
No, I agree. Definitely with the safe harbor, you can continue to support both transactions and both connectivity methods, for example, because again, remember the safe harbor doesn't prohibit you from offering any other type of connectivity to conduct the transactions. It just is a requirement to support the minimum requirements for that particular phase, for that particular transaction. So I agree, Rajan.
Thanks, Bob.
Thank you so much. I think this is a question for Kevin. So the question is, how is payload ID used in batch mode?
Now, the payload ID, it is required in both batch and real time, but it's just, it's really the rule is silent on exactly, how that value needs to be tracked, but it is something that needs to be there. So it's something that, as an implementation goes, you've got some leeway as to how you want to use it, but it needs to be included. And it needs to be unique within the domain of the party that's setting the value, because that identifier can be, it could be assigned by even the sender in both the batch and the real-time processing modes, and even the payload could even be resent in the absence of, even just any sort of persistence there. You can continue to reutilize an existing payload ID. So there's, I guess the short answer is the rule doesn't provide a lot of specific implementation details on how it must be used, other than it needs to be there in order to help, it's utilized to help track both the request and the responses.
Yeah, Kevin, just to add to that, there's two types of identifiers. There's the payload type, which is a part of the message envelope, and there's normative definition of the payload type within the payload types and processing modes table.
Right.
And that goes, there's two types essentially within the batch processing mode. There is one type of batch interactions where it's called the mixed mode, where you can have a mixture of transaction types within the single batch, and then there is a uniform batch which has all of the transactions of the same type. So those are the two types. And then to the payload ID, which is a globally unique identifier that goes with each of the requests, and there's a definition within the metadata table of the connectivity rule on how to set that value.
Thank you so much. And we have time for one more question. So let me read it. Mine is not part of Phase 4, was part of Phase 2. Can we deactivate it once we go to Phase 4? Who would like to take that question?
This is Bob. I'll jump in and have Raj and Kevin add if they wish. This again is related to the safe harbor and the particular requirements for the phase. So each transaction is related to a phase. So that phase is then related to specific requirements around connectivity. So eligibility, claim status, and the 835, the remittance advice, are all based on Phase 2 connectivity, and those requirements are specific and are required to be implemented by all HIPAA-covered entities. So those would remain in effect for those transactions. So if you implemented SOAP and MIME for the eligibility transaction, for example, those would stay in place. When Phase 4, or if Phase 4 is required for implementation, or if you voluntarily implement that for the claims transaction, for example, then you would only implement the SOAP transaction and conduct that transaction in SOAP for batch, that's the requirement, or real-time as an option, for the claim, the 837. And so SOAP would be used exclusively for the Phase 4 transactions. So there is a divide for MIME. MIME is Phase 2, and those transactions kind of covered under Phase 2 connectivity, again, specific to the eligibility, the claim status, and the 835 transaction.
Thank you very much. And it looks like we are out of time for today. This slide shows some of our future webinar programming. The next slide shows ways that you can contact us if you have questions or comments. And finally, there's an appendix with additional information that we think you will find useful. Thank you for your time and have a great afternoon.